I'm a professor of Russian history at New York University. When I say Russian history, I mean European history, because we've changed how we look at Russia, and we look at it more as part of bigger things. So the biggest thing we can look at would be Europe and Asia. So when I do Russian history, I'm also doing European history. And this is part of the change that's taken place in our understandings of how to situate Russia, and especially the Russian Revolution. Now, the Russian Revolution, it's changed over the past, well, actually since the beginning, since 1917 itself. I mean, to try to understand what the significance is, what the legacy is, why we should study it at all, and why it's important today. And if you look at how historians and also the general readership look at the revolution, it's changed over time to reflect our own politics and our own changes as well. And it's mirrored very much what happened with the French Revolution as well. So if you begin with a certain kind of social history that was common certainly in the 1960s, 1970s, it was this big effort to try to understand revolutions, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, as real social movements and real uprisings from below, and the below rising up to take its proper place, to make material demands for the most part. And it was understood at the time by intellectuals, including historians, that this was a very fair and very legitimate way to mission to transform the polities they believed in. Meaning there's an old regime which is decrepit, it can't accommodate new kinds of changes and new kinds of social movements. The masses below, especially workers and peasants and soldiers, aren't in a position in the old regime to express their demands and to achieve their aims, mainly material, and so they overthrow the old regime. And it's generally understood among intellectuals, with few exceptions, that this is a good thing, and it's a legitimate thing. And they were looking at that time, particularly in the 1960s and into the 1970s, they're looking at the Russian Revolution as a prism, as a mirror for understanding their own politics as well. Remember, this is the time leading up to 1968, all across the North Atlantic and the industrialized world. 1968 was the moment when we're going to have a repetition of the revolution, except now it's going to be global. It's going to be across the industrialized world. And you have the uprisings in France especially, but it happened everywhere in Europe, including Eastern Europe, by the way. It happened in the United States. And what followed after that, beginning 1968, the failure of 1968, there was a transformation among the historians themselves. Gradual. It wasn't sudden, but it was gradual. And a movement towards a different understanding of the revolution as something which was at best more ambiguous. But there was a disappointment and a disenchantment with the possibility of having a revolution based on popular movements. And one way of looking at it would be to say that, sure, we understand that, in 1917, that there were people who didn't have enough food, they didn't have prospects, they didn't have upward mobility. That's fine, and it was the job of the government to do that, but it didn't, and we can understand why the revolution took place. That's one thing. But to say that those same people that we're trying to support should become the government is a different proposition altogether. And this is again reflecting the post-1968 period. And then something happens in the French historiography, which immediately takes hold in the historiography of Russia, which was a reassessment. And the most extreme case in France would be Fourier. The belief, in other words, that this was not about social movements, this was about ideologies, bad ideologies in particular. And it begins to take hold little by little among historians, especially in the United States. That's where the money was, that's where the big publications were. And you look at someone like Martin Malia. Martin Malia was very much a follower of Fourier, and he wanted to do for the Russian Revolution what Fourier had done for the French Revolution. Very Catholic, very conservative, and very confident in his categories. Catholic, I mean that in two senses. I mean, in the one sense, a belief that there's such thing as rights of individuals, conscience, autonomies. And on the other hand, Catholic in the sense of a certain pessimism about humanity, that we're basically sinners and you can't improve on certain things. And it should have been better, he would argue, that if in 1917, just as in 1789, we had left good enough alone. There's going to be hunger. We can try to alleviate some hunger, but you can't solve the problem of hunger. There's going to be poverty. You can let poverty be addressed through maybe some government measures, but that doesn't mean that you have to overthrow the entire system. It just means you solve the problem of poverty and hunger incrementally and gradually. But it's never really going to go away because people are basically not good. And this begins to take hold in the historiography of Russia as well. You begin to see it in some of Malia's students. He didn't have that many, but he had some very influential ones. And the big change took place with the publication of a book by Stephen Kotkin, which was a study in how socialists, communists, and Bolsheviks, Steve thought they were all the same thing, how all of these people began to change using their intellect things which defy the material reality. So Stalinism creates this huge edifice of a new kind of revolution, a new kind of socialism, a new kind of society where everything is completely integral, what others would call totalitarianism. And they did it based on a belief in the infinite improvability of humankind, that everybody can always become better. At the same time, a certain cynicism and a belief that, you know, although they did create socialism, socialism was a terrible thing. And so it's not that socialism went wrong, which is what some people would argue after 1917, or especially under Stalin. It's not that socialism went wrong, it's that socialism was a bad idea to begin with. And with socialism went the idea of popular interests, that workers and peasants had legitimate demands. And so it became a sort of different take on the revolution, certainly by the 1990s, I think, with a generation of historians like myself, yourself, who began to reassess and to say that, you know, the ideas underlying transformation and the ideas themselves were flawed. And there's a certain movement to say, and it had a very good products, I have no doubt about that. A certain movement to say that this was more about ideology, this was more about the force of ideas, not about material reality necessarily. And this was about, one of the many products of this was, it was about gender, it was about identity, working class identities. Someone like Kotkin and many others would agree that these were identities which were manufactured in people's heads. And then Stalinism was a process of trying to make them a reality. Well, and that brings us up to the present day for the most part, where we still have a pretty strong movement of people who believe that there was something about the revolution with legitimate social demands, that the old regime could not accommodate change. And a lot of these people, among our colleagues, and I think myself included, would argue that by looking at the Russian Revolution, we're addressing certain kinds of crises that we're also experiencing today. Meaning questions that we call today like of extreme inequality, questions of hopelessness. It takes various manifestations. The extreme would be, for example, refugees and race and gender, but also on a daily basis, this slow drip of lower wages, stagnant wages, a certain hopelessness, as we watch a very small part of the population accumulate huge wealth. And when we're writing about Russian history, we're aware of this contemporary context, and so we're writing about ourselves at the same time. And looking to the Russian Revolution and saying, well, look, you know, basta, you know, okay, we understand, you know, certain things went wrong. We're still arguing about what went wrong, but the original demands that there has to be a more equal society, the original demand that there needs to be some sort of transformation, intellectual but also material, in order to improve people's lives. This we're writing about as we write about the Russian Revolution. And then there's still another part of the profession which insists that no, you know, if you try to change things in a revolutionary manner, you're only going to make things worse. And they're also speaking about the contemporary world. You know, when we look around, you know, European politics, American politics, you're going to see a lot of people saying that, you know, it's bad what's happening in some ways, we understand this, but the alternative is worse. And so that brings us to Tina, there is no alternative. And this is something that they apply also to the Russian Revolution. You see what happens when you try to actually materially change. All right, and this is the general landscape historiographically. And there's another kind of division which you can look at the same issues but through a different kind of division, which was the development of modernity and liberalism, which I think in some ways are very interconnected. But there are different versions of liberalism and different versions of modernity, which began together and then separated out into different parts. And the one was about whether revolutions and human progress more generally, beginning with the American Revolution, then the French Revolution, and finally the Russian Revolution. Is the purpose of a revolution only to give you the circumstances in which you yourself can undertake your own transformation and your own improvements? And if you happen to be poor, that's not our business. The Constitution, in other words, is not going to tell you that you have the right to subsist, necessarily. The Constitution is not going to say that you have the right to be free of poverty, want, and uncertainty. A Constitution is only going to give you the political conditions in which you can act. And so it reinforces this separateness between government and population, between economy and state. And if you look at it in those terms, it's this vision which tends to be triumphant right now. And looking at the Russian Revolution, we say, well, here's an example where there is a regime which was following a certain kind of trajectory, recognizable if you lived in Western Europe or even the United States. It was recognizable because there was a movement, liberals for the most part, but even among autocratic ministers, to create a society of preconditions. A society, in other words, in which we're going to give you political freedoms, freedom of assembly, freedom of trade, perhaps tolerance, maybe even freedom of conscience, and allow you to develop as an individual. In 1917, October 1917, not February, but October 1917, a new government came to power, weak, small, but then gradually wins the Civil War, introduces a system in the 1920s, and then finally revolutionizes that system in the 1930s under Stalin, which claims that it's not only giving you the opportunities and the political conditions, but it will, at root, transform the material existence of the population. It will address both your political development and your intellectual development, but it will also address your, it will guarantee that you're going to have food to eat, you'll have a roof over your head, you'll be free of insecurity and want. Now, according to the critique of the Russian Revolution, that's what Stalinism was. Stalinism did guarantee, on the basis of a certain kind of modern ideology, that's what Marxism was, a modern ideology. It guaranteed that everybody would have enough and everybody would have sufficiency, material. And this was the great foundation of the Soviet system. I mean, this is what made the Soviet system stable for so long, for 70 years. And this is what made it a model for other countries as well. Communist movements, but even socialist movements, even conservative movements, were forced to react to this and to emulate it. So that the welfare state in Western Europe can be explained to a large extent by the counter model of the Soviet Union, where beginning with Keynes, but then continuing with the welfare state all over Western Europe, and even to some extent the United States, scrambled to create an alternative to communism, which did provide for people's material needs. So the Russian Revolution in this case had a profound legacy in the transformation of Western European polities as well, and to some extent American. Canadian would be another example. So, the welfare state in Western Europe, looking at the Soviet model, begins to integrate both the material and the political into one understanding. And the welfare state is, the first one is the Soviet Union. And then alternatives to that kind of welfare state in the Western European welfare state. A belief, in other words, that all these things have to be considered together at the same time as a total view of the society. Well, by the same token, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 gives us less incentive to do better. And we can see, with the rise of certain kind of what we'd call neoliberalism, the belief, in other words, that government should not be involved in the lives of the population, in the functioning of society, in the regulation of the economy. States begin to become less and less involved, a part of their triumphalism after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which they said not that we succeeded after 1945 because we took account of what the Soviet Union had taught us, but they say something quite the opposite, which was we succeeded because we were against the Soviet Union and what the Soviet Union stood for. And it allowed us to begin the slow process of dismantling some of our welfare state as well, which is what we're seeing right now. So when we have conversations about the Russian Revolution, all of us are aware, usually consciously, that we're having conversations about ourselves. And we're still debating this question now, here now, especially with certain urgency, about what kind of political movement, if not socialism and if not communism, what kind of social movement can accommodate the real grievances of the population, which we have, with this sort of vulgar concentration of wealth and the vulgar disregard for the needs of a very large part of the population. And so what kind of movement can accommodate this? Well, you know, in East Central Europe, you know, look at Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, even some of those other areas around the Baltic states, or Finland to some extent, there's been this gradual militant insistence that the solutions have to lie outside of government policy. That the government and the state have to continue the process of disengaging from society and disengaging from the economy and let the economy do its own work. And this has been spilling over into the European Union more generally. So who's going to speak for them? But who's going to speak for the people who've been left out, which are more and more people, as we know? I don't only mean the margins, refugees. I don't only mean gender, although that's part of it, but I mean a generalized contempt for social demands. Which is sometimes militant and sometimes scary. Well, for the time being, you know, without the Soviet model, I think we've reached the point where it's the right wing which has been expressing these grievances much better than the socialists. And in many ways, the reason is that the socialists have stopped being socialists. Well, this is also part of the legacy of the Russian Revolution. And so we could look at 1917 in terms of the two alternatives that were being offered. February would be, it seems, and I think it's true, February would be the political revolution, that kind of liberalism. A revolution, in other words, in which you guarantee civil rights, mass participation. Russia becomes the first great power to give the vote to women, actually, in 1917. Finland had done it a little before, but Finland was also part of the Russian Empire, let's remember. There was the belief that not only is it right to say that the goal of the revolution was political, but in fact an insistence that it has to be only political, because if you make it a social revolution, the entire edifice would collapse in terms of the conflicts between the classes, between the estates, between the nationalities. So it has to be a political revolution. And this didn't work, obviously. Well, as the system B was collapsing in the course of 1917, largely for economic reasons, as it was collapsing, even these liberals and moderate socialists began to say that our solution has to be in the state. It's the only institution that can bring us all together. And we mean this not only in terms of hitting people on the head and the coercive aspects of the state, but also bringing people in so that they can be part of the state and use the state to reestablish a sense of unity and stability. So the apogee becomes Bolshevism. So Bolshevism looks like a sharp break, which it is, because it goes much further than anyone else had imagined. But the Bolsheviks themselves are drawing on these strong roots of Russian statism and begin to look at the state as not only the tool that will affect change, but the place where people will exist. So you could say this is exceptional. And I would say that's not quite true. I don't think it's exceptional. Intellectually, they're drawing on not only Marxism, which explains Bolshevism, but they're also drawing on Hegelianism, a certain view of Hegelianism, a radical view of Hegelianism, which held that the moment when we become full citizens and full human beings is when we enter the state. If you look at it this way, in terms of a certain, not only Marxist, but also Hegelian liberal tendency, you begin to see that Russia is not exactly outside of European discourse, it's a part of European discourse. And this is how we've been changing our understandings also of Russia, not as something outside, exceptional, unusual, exotic, however you want to term it, but as something which is integral to this shared spectrum of modernity. So where do the Greeks exist? Well, they existed in the empires. And you begin to trace all these movements of people, not only in the old Venetian and Ottoman empires, which is where most Greeks existed, but then you begin to trace them through a newly affirmative Russian Empire, Bonaparte and the French Empire, Britain and the British Empire, and you begin to find all these circulations of people who are scrambling to figure out who they are in these imperial contexts, which I find very interesting, but it's taking me away from the modern period.